I think we should start. Good afternoon. Feel free to sit on the floor, to have a taste of Sufism. I'm sorry for this small room. I knew we can't, Salma, they're all booked. They're all booked. So I am again sorry for the small room and for starting late. I knew we were popular on campus, but I did not know that we are that popular. But I also see new faces in the room, so if you want to know more about our events, and we have a couple of events about Sufism coming up, so you can like the Facebook page of the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages. You can also follow us on Instagram, or sign the handout for your email, your name, your phone number, and we'll get in touch with you. I'll attribute this successful audience, at least, successful attendance, to two things: the barakah of Sufism and the haiba of our Sheikh, Alexander Kynsh. So my name is Bilal Orfali, and I'm the chair of the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages here at AUB. It is with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome my friend, my co-editor, and soon my co-author, Professor Alexander Kynsh of the University of Michigan to the American University of Beirut to deliver a talk under the title of Sufi Adab as Pedagogy, Shaykh Murid Relationship Across the Ages. I'm honored to introduce such a towering figure in Islamic studies. Alexander and I have met in several Arab, European, and American cities, but this is the first time that we meet in Beirut, and even better, at my home institution, the American University of Beirut. I have been a murid of this Shaykh for years. Alexander Kynsh is Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan and Principal Investigator of a research project on Islamic studies funded by the St. Petersburg State University. His research interests include Islamic mysticism or Sufism, Quranic studies, the history of Muslim theological, philosophical, and legal thought, and Islamist movements in comparative perspective. He has numerous academic publications on these subjects, including 9 books. My students in the room will immediately recognize Alexander as the author of Ibn Arabi in the later Islamic tradition, and the author of Islamic mysticism, which is a modern classic in this field, or as a translator of Qushayri's Risala, whose English translation is more accurate than any of the editions of the texts. We often joke in the field that this is the Risala al-Knishiyya, not al-Qushayriya. His most recent book is Sufism, A Modern Perspective, scheduled to come out in 2017 by Princeton University Press. This book, which I had the pleasure and privilege to read, is not only a history of Sufism, but is also a book on the politics governing the study of Sufism. Alexander's scholarship is a good model of how to approach a world religion such as Islam from inside and outside, how to collate historical evidences, read them, and use them to provide fascinating narratives that are nuanced, informative, and most importantly, objective. Alexander Kynsh and I enjoy working for Brill for free. Believe it or not, Brill actually cleverly does this to you. You get addicted to working for them. Since 2005, Kynsh has served as section editor for Sufism on the editorial board of the famous Encyclopedia of Islam, 3rd edition. He is also executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism and the handbook series associated with it, Brill Leiden. I'm a co-editor of this encyclopedia and series. Alexander and I spent our afternoon working on a handbook on early Sufism. Working with him is a true pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Kynsh at AUB.
Thank you very much. Is it okay? Thank you very much, Professor Orfale. It's a great pleasure to speak to such a large audience. Normally, lectures or presentations on Sufism do not attract such a large crowd in Western countries, with some exceptions. When I come to Kazan, for instance, in the Russian Federation, I see also large groups of people or followers of various groups, Sufi groups, located in the Volga region in the Russian Federation, in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. So, yes, we're slaves of Brill. We work free, donate our time and our efforts and our eyesight to the noble task of publishing works in the field of Islamic mysticism or Islamic ascetic mystical tradition. And also we spend a lot of time working with authors who contribute to our book series, to the encyclopedias, and so on. Today I will talk about adab as pedagogy and Shaykh Murid relationship across the ages in particular. It's based on the research for my book, which the publisher wants to call Sufism, A New History of Islamic Mysticism. I was opposed to the title. It was supposed to be called Sufism Reimagined. But the publisher has his own ideas, what is marketable and what is not, so I had to submit to their will. Otherwise, they were very lenient, but only when it came to the title, they became like a wall. I hit the wall and I decided that I should probably just submit, and I did. So my presentation will last for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe 50. Then after 50 minutes, I will wrap up my presentation and will take your questions. I apologize for the room not being large enough. No one expected such a great turnout of people. So, على عدد الصوفي من المنهاج التعليمي. That would be in Arabic, the الشيخ المريد العلاقة بين الشيخ المريد أبرز العصور. I will talk about this topic, and I begin with a classic of American anthropological theory, Clifford Geertz, who says, religion, by fusing ethos and worldview, gives to a set of social values what they perhaps need most to be coercive, an appearance of objectivity. In sacred rituals and myths, values are portrayed not as subjective human preferences, but as the imposed conditions for life implicit in a world with a particular structure. I use this epigraph, and you will see its relevance as I deliver my presentation. But Clifford Geertz studied Sufism in the Maghrib and then compared it to the area which he knew much better. It was Indonesia. His work was mostly on Indonesian Islam, which is very interesting and sometimes controversial. But his idea about religion sanctifying certain values and certain world outlooks appealed to me. That's why I chose an excerpt from his book as a starting point for my presentation. I begin with the Sufi Adab as the foundation of Sufi life. First of all, Sufi Adab, as we know it is based on our readings of the text. People like my colleague Professor Orfale and myself just rummage through the text, and then we discover the normative agendas pursued by the authors of this literature. What is normative? It means that the authors of these textbooks on adab wanted Sufis or followers of ascetic mystical stream in Islam to behave in certain ways. And therefore, they described what they expected people to do, not what actually Sufis were doing. So the first question I have to pose, to what extent the Kutub fi Adab al-Sufiya are reflecting of the real lives of real Sufis in real conditions, historical conditions. And I come to the conclusion that although these sources are indeed normative, they are idealized patterns of behavior presented as the law followed by the Sufis. I'm not using the word law accidentally. Actually, Al-Ghazali says that Sufism is a Sharia al-Khassa. He uses this term, and I was struck by it at one point. So, despite the normativity of the sources, despite the normative nature of the Sharia al-Khassa as Sufism, we still are able to reconstruct how actual Sufis behaved under certain concrete conditions. Why? Because of what the Sufi literature describes, it gives not only just positive examples, but also negative examples. And the negative examples can be construed as deviations from the norm that give us a glimpse of what was actually happening and why the norms that were offered by the authors of the normative textbooks, why these norms were necessary, because certain Sufis behaved in unpredictable and controversial way, and therefore the authors of the books wanted to correct their behavior by giving this normativity to their narratives. Is this understood? Basically, there is an ideal norm that we find in the literature, but the same literature provides us with examples that help us to understand why the certain norms were articulated. Because the authors wanted to impose some order on the behavior of individual Sufis. They didn't always succeed in that. So I tried to find an English equivalent for adab, and I came up with good manners and proper conduct for Sufism. And then I used Sufi authors to identify what they understood to be good manners and proper behavior. First, how one should behave toward God himself. This is part of the adab. And the second part of the adab, how you deal with individuals within your community, with other Sufis, and also outside the community, the commoners. The idea that there are common people who are not initiated into Sufism looms very large in Sufism, and I will talk about this more. So Sufism, as I already said, quoting Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun, is a Sharia Khassa. And this, of course, is very controversial from the viewpoint of the Salafis, who think that there is only one Sharia which they understand and which they want to implement in real life. So definitions of adab are legion. Practically every Sufi textbook on adab contains a definition of adab, which basically falls into these two categories: how one behaves toward God and how one behaves toward other human beings. But if you want the concrete ideas that we find in the adab literature, they stress, of course, sincerity, ikhlas, sidq, it's misspelled, it's sidq, S-I-D-Q, sidq. That is also means it's truthfulness in one's behavior. Khawf, as you know, it's fear of God. Taqwa is also fear of God. Haiba, that is being in awe in the presence of God. And what Sufi literature emphasizes is that Sufis should combine their internal state and their external behavior. All practically Sufi manuals agree on that. that al-zahir should coincide and should reflect al-batin, vice versa. Sufis also produce psychologists such as al-muhasibi, a person who investigates or examines his internal motives to determine what he actually intends, what the true intention of the human heart is. You know, al-amal bin niyat, it's a famous hadith, but Sufis took it really very seriously in order to determine what lies in the subconscious of human individuals, why they behave the way they do, why they go to the mosque, to show off, to demonstrate their piety to the people outside the community and inside the community they live in, or they go there for the sake of God, min ajlillah, or min ajl al-haq. So this is the object of Sufi psychology, which appears very early, much earlier than the idea of psychology in the modern sense of the world. Hassan al-Basri calls it ilm al-qulub wal-khawatir. Khawatir means the kind of back thoughts. And Kafka said that human beings are, it's a rat hole of back thoughts. Thoughts that are hidden, but they are real and they are motivating force. And that's Hassan al-Basri, whether he actually was the first Sufi psychologist, we wouldn't speculate, but definitely there are ideas that are attributed to him by Abu Talib al-Makki, who says Hassan al-Basri was our father, the father of what he calls tasawwuf. So he was a Sufi before Sufism appeared. So why, again, I'm returning to Adab, which of course has psychology is very important for Adab, because you examine your real motives in order to determine whether your intentions are good or bad. So to quote the most famous definitions of Sufi Adab, Sufis are the people of good manners, and all of Sufism is nothing but Adab. That's why Adab was chosen as the presentation. I have always been, and probably many of you have been fascinated by Ibn Khaldun. Yes, of course, he is such a towering figure. Father of sociology, he is called, father of everything, of all modern historiographical sciences. Like Hassan al-Basri, he is the father of many firsts. So, but he actually, when I started to read him closely, I discovered that he uses a lot of al-Ghazali, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, and in discussing Sufism in particular. What is fascinating about Ibn Khaldun is that he is an outsider to Sufism. He writes this with the same, like, le degré zéro de l'écriture, zero bias in writing. So he describes kalam, he describes history writing, he describes occult sciences with the same kind of, I would say, aloof approach. He doesn't get involved, but he wants to describe the intellectual universe in which he lives, and he says, kalam is this, fiqh is this, Sufism is this. But of course he needs a source, and he uses al-Ghazali. Ghazali's stance vis-a-vis Sufism is very controversial. Some say he was a practicing Sufi. Others say he became one only later in his life. And whether he was a fully fledged Sufi is difficult to, it's impossible to see.
No, I think it's too bright color.
We can dim the lights?
Yeah, much better.
Much better.
Yeah, that's a good. I should have used larger font.
Maybe.
But so both Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun, who writes in his Shifa as-Sa'il, a very famous treatise on Sufism, which he wrote he started while in Maghrib, but later he continued probably to rewrite it when he moved to Egypt. And when he became head of this very major Sufi institution in Egypt. So he has to prove that he knows something about Sufism. So he writes this textbook, Shifa As-Sail, where he presents what he considers to be the correct Sufism, and then discusses whether or not a Sufi can become a practicing Sufi without the help of the Sufi master. Can one become a Sufi without a Sheikh? It's a very interesting examination, but it is not also original to him, because he's responding to an earlier polemic in the Maghrib between Ash-Shatibi and Ibn Abbad Arundi, the two individuals of whom you may have heard. Ash-Shatibi, of course, is now famous for his Maqasid al-Sharia. He's elevated to such a great height. He lived in the 14th century. Ibn Abbad Arundi is also one of the favorite authors, translated into French and in English by my friend John Renard. In other words, Ibn Khaldun responds to the visions of Sufism that he finds in contemporary Maghribi Sufi tradition. And both Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun identified two types of jurisprudence. I like that. Fiqh al-Zahir, which you understand is the madahib, the Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki. I think for the Maghrib also the Zahiri is important, because Ibn Hazm was there, and there were followers of Zahirism. Ibn Arabi also mentions this in the 7th century Hijra, which is the 13th century. So it was there. This is Fiqh al-Zahir, and it is the domain of the body. So Fiqh al-Zahir regulates the actions of your limbs, the limbs, jawarih of your body. Whereas the actions and motives of the heart and the souls are regulated by inward jurisprudence, fiqh al-batin. So this division, I think, also it's very felicitous, because it removes many obscurities that we find in Sufi literature proper. Because Ibn Khaldun likes this idea, he takes it from Ghazali and forefronts it in the beginning of his discussion of Sufism, that it is part of the internal jurisprudence. If internal jurisprudence allows the believer to enjoy piously the benefits, masalih, of his mundane existence, the internal jurisprudence secures him the benefits of the hereafter. And as I already mentioned, there should be a complete agreement between al-Zahir and al-Batin. Here, Ibn Khaldun and al-Ghazali agree with the earlier Sufi authors. In our discussions of Sufism, there's always a debate over when Islam ends and Sufism begins, and vice versa. Today, many Western scholars, especially Carl Ernst, who is my respected colleague in the University of North Carolina, he insists that Western scholars tend to detach Sufism from Islam, reify. There is this nice term, reification, making it something tangible. They say they detach Sufism from Islam, thereby doing damage to the integrity of Sufism and Islam. And I agree with this in principle, but it turns out that Sufis themselves didn't quite see the situation from this perspective. They wanted to be special. And how they wanted to be special, they allegorized, internalized, and intensified the traditional moral and ethical values that were shared by the majority of Muslims. For instance, scrupulousness in food. If we read how Sufi were scrupulous, they wouldn't share a meal with a soldier because they considered his wealth to be ill-gotten. They would not go to an invited dinner in the official's house because they felt that the food served there was not halal, whereas, of course, for the majority of Muslims it was halal and so forth. It's just one example, but we find the same kind of extreme, I would say, approach in the matter of other traditional Muslim values, such as tawakkul. If people simply invoke tawakkul, fine. The ordinary people, the drivers like this tawakkul on every car in Pakistan or in the Arab country, tawakkul ala Allah. Yeah, everyone shares this. But how you practice tawakkul? The majority simply go about their business without paying much attention to the gods being the only true supplier of everything for sustenance. But a person who wants to internalize and practice tawakkul, he or she would go to greater lengths. He, for instance, would just sit in the yard of his house and wait for a chicken to jump into his lap. Then he would eat it. That, of course, these people, if they existed, it's a kind of hypothetical individual waiting, they died out because they simply stopped. Therefore, Sufis dedicate a lot of time to speaking where tawakkul ends and starvation starts. So you have to earn your livelihood, but you don't have to save anything for the next day. You should live with this moment. If you have some provision God provided you, then you can consume it in a good faith and be happy. So discussion of makasib is a large literature in Sufism, including al-muhasibi, for instance, what is permissible and not. What I'm talking about, and I can say the same thing, what is the sincerity, istiqama, shukr, sabr, sidqa, hayya, and so forth, huzn, khushu'. Sufis tend to push everything almost to the very limit, but stop short of basically preventing human beings from existing, starving themselves, for instance, or surrendering any action, refusing to participate in any social interactions. But what I found also interesting, so they say everything should be internalized and intensified, every Muslim value, and that's what sets Muslims apart from the rest, Sufis apart from the other Muslims, from ordinary human beings in general. But they tend to elevate and to allegorize the implements of the Sufi costume. For instance, the khirka, the Sufi patched frock, becomes the sword belt of the profession of God's oneness. And the cap on the Sufi's head is understood as the crown of reverence, symbolizing his having freed himself from arrogance and pride. And when Sufis wear black, Sufis implicitly announces that their nafs has died onto this world. It's no longer active. Die before you die, as you know. There's a famous saying. So even this is what I call allegorizing approach. They allegorize elements of their life. They see a dimension outside that other people do not see. They see the whole world is an assemblage of allegories that Sufis interpret, and they insist that they are seeing what they call haqaiq, the true realities of things, whereas other people see only appearances, zawahir. These standards that I've described, and also this allegorizing tendency, eventually make for a very elitist ethos, that is, a way of being in the world, a pattern of behavior. Because very few people are able to implement such rigorous standards. And that's why there's a large dropout rate among beginning Sufis. For instance, in the Sulami's book on Tabaqat al-Sufiya, we find a story when one teacher had 120 students and later it was down to just 3 or 4. So the dropout rate was much higher than in this university or even in the school, in a disadvantaged school in my own state of Michigan, in Detroit area. So once the Sufis realize that they are special people, they begin to theorize this idea. And one of the first Sufis to actually put this idea in writing was Abu Nasr al-Sarraj al-Tusi. Tus is an old city near present-day Mashhad in Iran, where Ghazali was born also, and it later became the Mashhad named after Ali Rida, one of the Imams, the 8th Imam of the 12 of Shia. So Abu Nasr al-Sarraj, an Iranian basically, with Arab connections. Most of the people actually I'm mentioning, they're Arabs who lived in Persian lands, whose mother tongue, their mothers were Persian, they spoke Persian, but by their ancestral names indicate that they were Arabs. Sulami, Sulaim, right? Qushayri, Qushayr, and At-Tirmidhi, although he has a Persian name, he's also had an Arab father. So it's an interesting that demographic that I won't be able to address in detail, but it also catches my attention as I read through these sources. Most of Sufi literature is generated in Iran, in present-day Khorasan, and Nishapur in particular, but what is remarkable is that theoretization is conducted by Arabs who became thoroughly Persianized, or Persians who became Arabized, you can say. It's an interesting ethnic dimension to this literature. But I will move on because I'm running out of time and I would like still to show you. So he says that there are 3 categories of people. People of this world whose manners have to do with eloquence, balagh, rhetoric, and study of various sciences, names of rulers, poetry of the Arabs, and so forth. So these are kind of erudite intellectuals who are people of this world. They're in possession of mundane knowledge, which is good for this world, but no provision for the hereafter. And then the second category are men of religion, and that's where, of course, our ulama would be offended. They are called ulama rusum or ulama zahir, and they are the ones who acquire their good manners by subjugating their base souls, restraining their limbs from prohibited things, and trying to tame their passions and appetites. But they are not even, they're still not good enough for the Sufis. The next category is actually the Sufis, who themselves fall into 3 categories, which I will not discuss because I have. But they are called khususiyya or khawas, and their manners consist of purifying their good hearts, scrutinizing their inner thoughts. These are all elements of adab. Purifying the hearts, scrutinizing their inner thoughts, being faithful to their pacts, observing conditions required by every spiritual moment, waqt. In other words, you should behave as your instinct tells you in a given moment. You shouldn't think about the past or the present. You should live with the present. It's an ancient Greek idea which philosophers practice. There's a very good book by Ador which is called Philosophy as a Way of Life. That's how ancient philosophers wanted to live. Interestingly, this idea which we find in Greek culture, in philosophy, it made its way somehow into the ethos of Sufism. They also want to live with the present moment and enjoy it. Or if it is a bad moment, okay, you submit to it anyway. As they say, I submit to the commands of the moment. So what else do they do? They pay little attention to tempting thoughts. I already told you about the back thoughts that we all, khawatir, which we all experience. And they implement the rules of proper behavior in striving towards God by being constantly in His presence and entering the stations of proximity to Him. What is it? It means that Sufis are experiencing the presence of God more directly and more intensely than any other group of believers. And that idea is, again, not unique to Sufism. We find it in Christian mysticism. There is a huge collection of volumes called The Presence of God, A History of Western Mysticism, by Bernard McGuinness. It will come to me. McGinn, M-C-G-I-N-N. So it's called The Presence of God. But Sufis do the same. They feel the presence of God in every moment of their existence, with every breath. You see, I'm continually drawing parallels between Sufism and other ascetic mystical traditions in outside Islam, and that's what I dedicate a lot of text in my new book to that particular comparative aspect, because it is normally missing from Western discussion of Sufism. Why? Because most of the Western scholars, they specialize in Islamic studies, for instance, and in Islam and Quran. They know their stuff very well, but they don't know what happened before, who were Stoics, who were Epicureans, who were Manichaeans outside the Christian tradition, and who were Jewish mystics. They do not know that, and they think they should not know. I think the future of our intellectual discipline lies in looking outside the borders. I always felt very comfortable talking only about Sufism and not thinking about other groups. But I realized at some point, very late in my life, unfortunately, that it is a very short-sighted way to see things. We should see things in their organic integrity and unity, because the Mediterranean basin where you live was a melting pot. I think it's already a truism to say that, but it was an intellectual melting pot with lots of floating ideas, and humans tend to imitate each other and borrow from each other, like to some extent like apes. Yeah, we are aping each other, and Christian mystics aped Stoics and Epicureans and Cynics, whereas I think to some extent Muslims were fascinated by monastic lifestyle, and the borrowings were taking place. It was very selective borrowing, and always these ideas were Islamicized and practices, but they existed. For instance, Sufis decided that living in communities of like-minded individuals, which were called zawiya in Arabic, and khanegah in Persian, that was a good thing, or ibad. So they created kind of monasteries. They wore rough-patched garments, which were called hair shirts in the Christian tradition. They listened to music. The monks also performed music, very beautiful chants, Christians, and they withdrew into 40-day seclusion. Chile, it's in Persian. Traveled without provisions, begged for food and shelter, often forfeited marriage bonds for the sake of their beliefs. I won't delve on celibacy. It's a very big issue, but many Sufis chose to take wives, but only for procreation, not for pleasure, and then once the children were born, they stopped having intercourse at all. So Fritz Meyer, whom I mentioned here, makes a lot of comparisons with Catholic monasticism, between Catholic monasticism and Sufis, and he talks about monastic adab as opposed to Sufi adab, which is the subject of my presentation. So how much time do I take? Yeah, but it's very hot here, so people are tired. And as soon as I begin to see your eyes are becoming like glassy, I will probably stop and maybe entertain you
That
with
can
it.
happen from tears too.
Yeah. I don't think this is not my intention, Nia, to bring anyone to tears here. It's just to share my observations that accumulate. Oh, sorry. It's a commercial call from the United States. They want to sell me an insurance or something, ruining me in them as they do this, and also embarrassing. So you may have heard about Bruno Latour. It's a very popular and fashionable intellectual from Bordeaux, originally from France. He wrote a book, Reassembling the Social, an Introduction to Actor Network Theory, which is abbreviated as ANT, so it's like ant. It's the insect. But there's a lot of things that he has to say, but what I like about, I selected this, a quotation from his work to focus on the role of sheikhs. We discussed the adab, now we will discuss the sheikhs. Any group needs some people to define who its members are, what they should be, and what they have been. These are constantly at work, justifying the group's existence, invoking rules and precedents, and measuring up one definition against the others. So, leadership is of great importance for Sufism. Sufism consists of practices, which I discussed at some length. It consists of teaching, which I will also discuss, allegorizing or approach or intensifying approach. Sufism is also institutions. I mentioned to you that Sufis lived in independent houses. Originally, they, of course, assembled in the mosques, like all the other Muslim groups, but then gradually they acquired their own structures, like brick and mortar structures, which are a very interesting phenomenon. And and now the relations between the leaders and their followers is another prominent subject that I would like to address. Marshall Hodgson, the American scholar who died very young, and he was just 43 in University of Chicago, but he wrote a famous book, The Venture of Islam. It's like a very risky venture. He says that it was like any human enterprise. And he said that the ties that bound Sufi communities can be defined as Piri Muridi discipline. And he introduced this idea, and it became very widely used as a explanatory paradigm to explain how Sufism co-gelled into an independent movement. That the relations between master and his disciples, or her disciples, because they were sheikhs as well as sheikhs, they were the cement that held together Sufi communities. And the relations were mutual. I will not discuss them in detail. That both the disciples owed the master certain actions and certain practices and certain ideas that they were supposed to cultivate, whereas the master also took responsibility for his wards, and he also was obligated to do certain things that were expected to him. Here I come to the ideas of truth claims, and I will now be running through my presentation more quickly. What fascinated me about Sufism is the construction of an intellectual universe. It's an intellectual universe which includes a cosmology, that is how the cosmos, how the universe is structured, its origin, its current situation. This is cosmology, but there was a gnoseology. You can say epistemology, that is the theory of knowledge. So the Sufi universe consisted of that vision of the world, how it's structured. It was mostly, I would say, Ptolemaic and to some extent Neoplatonic. But there was also gnoseological claims that were made by the Sufi leaders. That's how Sufi leaders become attractive to their disciples. They make claims. I will not say whether they are verifiable or not, because I will be then losing my position as a neutral observer. But they make claims that make them extremely attractive. And so the masters construct an intellectual universe complete with a gnoseology, that is theory of knowledge, how you obtain knowledge, what knowledge is worth obtaining, what is not. And then they construct a cosmos, a vision of the world, which is hierarchical. So both the theory of knowledge and the universe are hierarchical. And the Sufi masters position themselves at the top of the gnoseological pyramid. They say, we know how things are in reality, bil-haq or bil-haqiqa, or we know haqa'iq al-ashya. So that was what they constructed. I will not go into details about this tripartite structure, alam al-shahada, alam al-malakut, alam al-jabarut, but you see the hierarchy. And this hierarchy is reflected in the stages of knowledge that people acquire. I also was interested in that Sufis had to live, they had to exist, they had to get funding, as we call it today, from somewhere. So they got funding from donors, from generous providers of awqaf, or habus, they're called in North Africa. So that's how Sufi institutions functions. Pious donations and gifts of laymen and laywomen. Very often Sufis received substantial amounts of money from female members of the sultanic lineages, from rulers' families, from the emirs' families, and so on. I already alluded to the changing type of relations between the Sufi masters and the Sufi disciples. At first, and this, I'm not sure this is the correct thesis. If you can enlighten me, I would be happy to accept your viewpoint and actually take it on board. But originally, it seems that the relationship between the sheikh and the murid was very informal. So one murid was looking for a sheikh. He comes to a city, it's like a muhaddis collecting hadith. Studies with him, maybe serves him, do some chores around his house, and then moves on to another one. So there is no permanent commitment. Gradually this changes. It's this educator sheikh, it was called Sheikh al-Ta'lim. And again, although I mentioned Fritz Meyer, he didn't fish the idea out of thin air, because he himself borrowed it from the polemic among the scholars whom I mentioned, Ash-Shatibi, Ibn Abbad al-Rundi, and Ibn Khaldun. They all three discussed the changing relations between the sheikh. So the original educator sheikh was a very nice kind of individual who accepted whoever would come for him for knowledge, and that individuals who studied with him incurred no obligations. Then they moved on with their lives. But then around 10,000, that is the 5th century of Common Era, there emerges the idea of a trainer sheikh. It's like a coach, a very strict, ferocious even individual who insists on you being his murid and nobody's else. You cannot leave the sheikh. You develop a lifelong obligation toward the sheikh. The sheikh, of course, also develops a similar obligation toward you, but that sheikh requires complete disclosure. Anything you saw in a dream should be disclosed. Any movement of your soul should be disclosed. So and I see, as I say, it's not I, but we see, that is Ibn Khaldun, Ash-Shatibi, Ibn Abad-Rundi, maybe Al-Ghazali already. They saw the Shaykh al-Talim as a caring advisor and Shaykh al-Tarbiyah as a demanding and occasionally harsh supervisor. Here, this slide is just, I summarize. I was fascinated that Fritz Mayr, who is accused of being Orientalist as usual, but he borrows all his ideas from Ibn Abad-Rundi, and then someone comes, I won't name her, and says, no, he came up with this idea because he was an Orientalist. But he didn't, the idea of the changing relations between the Shaykh and the disciple was already articulated as early as Al-Ghazali. And then simply Fritz Mayr translated it into German. So he didn't do much orientalizing because he was very committed to accuracy, like many German scholars do. He's very meticulous. He just translates what into the language of his culture, what he thought his German readers would appreciate and understand. He's not inventing anything.
Sorry, which century was the switch? Yeah.
It's about 5th century Hijra, 1000 Common Era. This date is named actually not by Ibn Mayr, but who simply repeats by Ibn Abad-Rundi. He says this when the transition came in his Rasail.
When was Arundi writing?
Rundi, it was before. He was middle of the 14th century. I didn't mention. Okay, so.
I saw you had his dates there somewhere. Yeah, died
Yeah.
792.
So, I'm going in the wrong direction. So time is, we have
5 minutes.
Huh?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, then. But I have many more things to say. But I will just
You can
start.
share the PowerPoint.
Yes, I will share the PowerPoint. So, distinct. I will now summarize what I've just said and the conclusions I arrived at. So, Sufi Adab is generally the adab pertaining to Shaykh Murid relationship, and it decisively shaped the lives of the Muslim community across the centuries. Combined with gnoseological or epistemological claims of Sufi masters, their promises of guidance and salvation, and an elaborate cosmology, Sufi Adab has been instrumental in creating and maintaining a universe of meaning and practical action that makes Sufism distinct from contemporary, let's say, conterminous, that is, the movements that exist parallel to it. World orientational systems and schools of thoughts with the attendant ethos and practices such as Islamic theology, jurisprudence, belles-lettres, and falsafa. I ask myself a question whether Max Weber's paradise of charismatic authority is correct. And then I arrive at the conclusion, yes, to some extent, there is a routinization of the charismatic authority. In order for the Sufi silsila to exist, the relations between the Sufi and his masters have to become a minhaj or tariqah. Tariqah, it's a method, Sufi method. It's not just a path to God, but it's also tariqah al-Shadiliya, it's a Shadili method. Tariqa al-Naqshbandiya, it's the method of Baha'u'ddin Naqshband and his predecessors and followers. So it's this is with the Sufi Adab institutionalization and rationalization of Sufi behavior takes place. And this corresponds to what Weber says. But what I disagree with Weber on is that Sufi masters didn't simply inherit the authority, but they had to work very hard to maintain and perpetuate it. If they just sit on their hands doing nothing, they will lose their status. And that's an important conclusion you arrive when you examine the history of individual salasil or individual turuq, that only active sheikhs were able to maintain this charisma. So it's not just an inherited privilege. It had to be worked on, constantly maintained, propped up, spruced up, if you wish, and so forth. And what we find in our history of Sufism is the history of successes. We don't find histories of failures. But there were many failures when the sheikh were not up to the task of maintaining authority. And when Sufi silsila and turuq dissipated because of the lack of suitable maintainers of the tradition. And how to measure success and failure. And I will probably stop here. Measuring success and failure, I believe, is a very difficult. Statistically, it's impossible. The failure rate is impossible to establish because we don't know anything about failures. Sometimes the sources make very kind of obscure remarks that silsila dissipated, or on the contrary, became invigorated and succeeded. So this is the final slide. So bear with me for a few more minutes, and then I will be open to your questions. So authority for authority's sake. Today there is this Marxian idea that people are only interested in maintaining their social status, taking advantage of their social status, dominating other people by imposing their authority on them, by using all kinds of tricks to do that. It's a typical Marxist approach. But this approach, as Weber's approach toward routinization of charisma, is not entirely applicable to Sufism, in my view at least. For today's Sufi leaders' claims to superior knowledge of and ability to guide their aspirants or murids through the complex hierarchy of realms of existence are, in general, a much safer bet because their guidance doesn't have, especially when their guidance doesn't have explicit political and social ramifications. They already inherited a universe of meaning that is so complex, it's so difficult, that the master is simply indispensable. And the master, without a master, one cannot navigate that very complex universe of meaning and very complex universe of knowledge. I said it many layered, many staged. So the Sufi leaders today, they rarely engage in innovation. They normally inherit this universe, learn it themselves, and then they guide people through this complex universes of meaning. And what they get in return is not really material advantages, but I think they get a much more subtler kind of pleasure by being listened to and adhered to and admired by their followers. It's not a material benefit. It's not even a social kind of benefit. It's being in the focus of attention, which is contrary to any Sufi idea, of course, that you should be humble and mutawadi'a and so forth. And but it's something that Marxian theorists like Bourdieu, like Foucault, and of course Edward Said, they lose this. They don't understand that there are other ways of presence and dominance and social status that do not necessarily mean domination and exploitation of other people. So that's one thing I make. The elaborate system of Sufi practice and universe of meaning attendant to it, so carefully constructed by many hands over many centuries, is now securely in place and ready to be used by those who present themselves as the inheritors of the great awliya of the past. Grounded firmly in the spiritual pedigrees, that is silsilas, of the saintly and charismatic custodians and promoters, the system looks imposing, even unassailable to many, albeit by no means all, and I know whom you think about now, be they insiders or outsiders to Sufism and Islam as a whole. Now, if we decide to challenge the gnoseological and soteriological meaning the claim that you can lead someone to salvation, the gnoseological and soteriological claims of modern day awliya, one has to demolish, stone by stone, the foundations of the sophisticated cosmological psychology of Sufism that the imaginations of Islam's greatest minds, driven by the noblest of aspirations, has managed to assemble over the past 100, I said it's actually 1,000,
100 centuries.
yeah, it's 114th century, no, 112th century, yeah. No, it's 1200 centuries. However, even if one should succeed in demolishing their claims and showing them to be inconsistent and mutually contradictory and self-serving, what will these individuals, the demolishers, offer in return? And I say that not much, other than disappointment. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Professor Kynsh, for this juicy, rich, mind-stimulating talk that contained a lot of food for thought. I sincerely apologize from our audience. We did not expect this turnout, but it's all in the spirit of mahabba and the spirit of ilm and etc. If you want the lecture, it will be shared on YouTube. It will be shared on the department's webpage, the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages. It will also be shared on our Facebook page. Also follow us on Facebook, the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages at the American University of Beirut. Or write down your email. Muhammad can stand and he has a piece of paper where you can write your emails and we'll be in touch. I promise a bigger room next time, for sure. If you have any suggestions also, write to me, Bilal Orfali from the Arabic department. We are here to serve the university and to serve human knowledge in general. So if you have any comments, any suggestions, any speakers that you would like to invite, I'll be happy to help with this. A few of course, we offer a class on Sufism in the Arabic department. So enroll in that, students or auditors. You can pursue an MA and a PhD in Sufism here at AUB in the Department of Arabic or in the Islamic Studies program. A few of our events that are coming up: the Madhahib of Modernity, March 20, Ziad Dalal, Arabic and Translation, Key Moments in Transcultural Connection. This is Roger Allen, the famous Roger Allen. March 30, April 7, a book signing by Iman Hmaidan and a discussion, it's a novel. April 24th, a book discussion by Jawdat Fakhruddin, Rumi Sufism and, between inverted commas, a Good Islam, April 27th, Jamal Ilyas. What is Sufism? A lecture by myself on April 25th. Against Cities, Hija al-Mudun, April 26th, also by myself. There will be a big conference on Khamriya, second week of May. All are welcome, of course. There will be 3 writers in residence. Wasin al-A'raj, Ibrahim Nasrallah, Jabbour Douaihi, in April and May. You're welcome to send us your writing, your creative pieces, and these famous novelists will comment on them, and they will hold office hours on campus, 5 to 7 hours every day. In March also, second week of March, we have 3 classes on calligraphy, workshop on calligraphy, a series of lectures on calligraphy, and the calligraphy exhibition. We have a few minutes now for questions, and I'm sure Professor Kynsh will be happy to answer yours. Please ask one question and raise your voice.
Yeah, and you can also, you may want to identify yourself because
Amira من Ara, I'm a tour guide. My question is the Shaykh al-Ta'lim and the Shaykh al-Tarbiyah. So Shaykh al-Ta'lim was a follower. How could he be a follower of a Sufi path or tariqa? If he was or not? Because if you don't have a tariqa or silsila, then you cannot have a no.
Shaykh al-Ta'lim, you are absolutely right. It's a very good point. Shaykh al-Ta'lim appeared before the silsilas, before charisma became routinized, as Max Weber would put it. So individual Shaykhs al-Ta'lim usually already had an informal silsila. They studied under someone, and eventually the source of all inspiration is Archangel Gabriel through Muhammad and all the way to that Shaykh. That much the Shaykh al-Ta'lim recognized and his followers recognized, but there was no institution. So what makes a difference between Shaykh al-Ta'lim and Shaykh al-Tarbiyah is the institution. The first Shaykh al-Tarbiyah appeared, probably the first of them, appeared in the early 11th century. So it was very accurate. The Ibn Abbad Arundi said it's 10,000. The year 1000. I'm sorry, I have something with numbers today. 1000. So about that time, the first individuals who had institutions. In other words, they already received waqfs from the individuals, and now they could support their followers from the awqaf given to them by the rulers. And if you support someone, you expect that person to be constantly around and not to move on to greener pastures. So institutionalization results in the relations becoming more rigid. So that's when the Shaykh Ta'lim gives a place or is replaced by Shaykh al-Tarbiyah.
Any famous Shaykh Ta'lim?
Yeah, the first one was Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Khair, who had one of the first khanaqahs, and he died. He came from an Iranian city of Meykhana. His nisbah is Meyhani, and he was active in the middle of the 11th century, and he was one of the first for whom manaqib, the literature praising his virtues appeared. So, and also karamat and all this things that make Sufism recognizable to us. But before that, the relations were much more informal, and there was no obligation for a murid to stay with one sheikh throughout his life or her life.
Jamil Abdul, I'm a graduate. I just have a question. How does Sufism exist nowadays? What is the role of Sufism in our life at modern days? Mm-hmm. And have they been lenient with the traditions and the requirements of the Shaykh Murid relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think Sufism in the 50s and 1950s, 1960s, everyone said Sufism will not be around in a few decades. It will simply die out. In Egypt, even, where the Sufis are thick on the ground, everyone expected it to dissipate. But Sufism it's a very rich tradition. I showed just a tip of the iceberg. And because it is rich, it can also draw on various aspects of its very rich legacy. And that allows it to adjust to the new situation. Now you can receive bay'ah. You go to Sheikh Hisham al-Qabbani's website, and you can take bay'ah on the internet without actually seeing the Sheikh. So that's how Sufis adjust. It may be a bad example, but Sufis are now very internet savvy. they maintain their presence and broadcast their presence through the internet very astutely, as all other groups who want the attention and who want followers. They are very good at using the modern technology to broadcast their message and attract followers. It means that, and nothing prohibits in the Sufi tradition them from doing that. They can be warriors, but they can be peaceniks. They can be peaceful individuals, completely turning their back to the world, but they can be also warriors like Sanusis were, or the followers of Sheikh Shamil in the Caucasus. So it means that the richness of the Sufi tradition ensures its continuation, although it takes different shape. Many people do not like the shape it takes. But in order to survive, you have to make compromises. And that's what Max Weber said. This is what is called routinization of charisma, or rationalization of charisma. And that's why Sufism is so viable, I would say, and vibrant, because of its ability to make changes to itself. Yes?
Shafia, then Salam, then the lady here, and then the gentleman.
Thank you so much for this talk. And I want to ask,
Raise your voice.
before Sufism became an institution, what would make the difference between the relationship teacher-student and the relationship Murid-Sheikh? Because even in other fields we can find these ties which are based on what they call barakat silsila, and there is all the time this adab, التعلم, adab al-julus, etc., in qira'at, in fiqh. And what would make Sufism, this relationship in Sufism, special?
Well, it's a complex question. It has to do with leadership. Leaders were very good psychologists, that's for sure. We know this from Al-Muhasibi. They knew human psychology very well, and they could read people's minds. Just one casual glance would open to them things that would be hidden from others. Yeah, yes. Firas, yes, or basira, whatever you call it, but yes. That's what makes their relation special. We can bemoan institutionalization. We can say it's a bad thing that Sufism had to institutionalize, but there was now no other way for it to survive. As I today say, they use internet. They existed at the time when their other institutions are developing. Madrasas, so khanaqas are parallel to madrasas. It's the same period. So they acquired their own brick and mortar buildings. The ulama had the madrasa, the Sufis had the khanaqa. But the Sufis offered much more, because they said, and I don't know whether you like this, they said the ulama are only sliding on the surface. They are very good to help you in dealing with the problems of this world. But if you want to be guided to the next one and to achieve najat, that is the salvation, then I am the one to be followed, because I combined ilm al-zahir wa ilm al-batin, and it is not unique to Sufism, because the same claims were made by Ismaili and Shi'i masters. So one of my graduate students actually says that Sufism developed as a response to the 12 Shia claims to superior knowledge. It had, because awliya is the term that is shared by the Shia and the Sunnis. For the Shia, the awliya are their imams. For the Sunnis, who say genealogy is important but doesn't matter that much. Many, of course, awliya, Sufi awliya were of descendants, sayyids of the ashraf, descendants of the Prophet, but many were not. So it's a more democratic kind of, I would say.
Of course, this is debatable. Salam.
Thank you very much for your talk. You've offered a masterful sort of panorama of the phenomenon, and you tie it together with a very thought-provoking discussion. But I'm just curious about the kind of temporal and spatial boundaries of your talk, of the glimpse of Sufism you gave, and wondered how would you modulate the Shaykh Murid relationship across space and time? How does the relationship change within the periods you discuss? What changes, what doesn't change? That's the first question, and I just want to follow that up with a very, very quick request for a clarification. You spoke in the beginning about a reimagining of Sufism, and that leads me to ask, where precisely do you position yourself, situate yourself in the wider debates? Where are the main departures in your discussion of Sufism?
Yeah, I need to write down your question.
He actually has a whole chapter about this in his forthcoming book. It's a whole chapter.
Yeah, it's. I'm now reading the proof, not proofreading. I'm reading the first edition of the book, so it should be out by probably by October.
And we're signing it here at AUB. That's what we agreed on today.
Manshuf, yeah. So the first question was
about the modulation.
Modulation.
Of tashkik al-tasawwuf. Just to borrow a term from Ibn Sina.
Yeah.
How do you modulate? How is the relationship different across periods and places?
So in the early, this Shaykh al-Talim, the questions were about Shaykh al-Talim. There were like beacons, like one sheikh in one city, another in a village, the other one in another city, and the murid would travel from one to another, like muhaddith, right? Collecting hadith. Incurring no obligation. But what I was about to say. But then things change. At some point, what I was about to say, I'm just blanking. So first the Sufis acquired their institution, that now there's a khanaqah, a permanent place where you when you join, you develop a long-term relationship. What also happens, and it's interesting, that murids come from different places to one established sheikh who is more successful than another in securing al-qaf. Does it make sense? Funding. So he can support more students, but then he sends them to all places where they come from to disseminate the same. You see the dynamics. So that one tariqah, one Naqshbandi becomes 5 Naqshbandis. Then one Qadri sheikh produces now several generations of sheikhs in very remote areas of the Muslim world. Sometimes they travel all the way from one part of India, for instance, for Suhrawardi, to another thousands of kilometers to study. And then, so it's like a fanning out of Sufism across the Muslim world. Now, Sufis who are thus trained, they perpetuate a certain tariqah. Tariqah, the method. It's Naqshbandi, Qadri, Suhrawardi, Shadili, and so forth and so forth. That's, I don't know if it's modulation, but the geographical spread becomes. And the next step is they go into the areas with non-Muslim population in India and Africa, setting up shops, taking local wives, and leading by example. So Sufis become foot soldiers of Islam, or hoplites of Islam, as Fritz Maya said. So the second question was?
Your position to the debate.
My position, I try to be neutral, which is impossible, of course. I try to step back and see how various conceptualizations of Sufism reflect the individual's personal convictions, personal beliefs, and whether how these convictions change the way we perceive Sufism. For instance, several influential scholars have determined our vision of Sufism. Mine was determined by Hodgson, for instance. And I am acutely aware of that. whereas in Europe, very few people know about Hodgson. They read Fritz Meyer or Massignon and a few others, so their vision is different. Even in the Western academia, there are schools, tariqas, right? Silsilas. It's the same silsila.
The Maryami?
Yeah, the Maryamiya, but Bilal can also, Professor Urfali can also has a silsila. It's Bergering, and Bergering studied with someone, and so on. So I studied with certain scholars. So, yeah, that's what, in other words, one of the new things I say about it, that the division between insiders and outsiders is sometimes imaginary. The two groups are feed off one another. Like I showed in the case of Ibn Abbad influencing Meyer. Meyer comes up, then uses the Weberian model to explain. I show the shortcomings of the Weberian model. But yes, the ideas are borrowed and reshaped both by outsiders and insiders to the tradition. That's what I find very fascinating.
We have time for a few
Sufism
more
is like a
questions.
meeting place of imagination.
The lady here, the gentleman here, you also had a question, right? But we'll start with the lady, sorry.
I hear in different tariqas that it's the sheikh who chooses the murid, it's not the murid who chooses the sheikh. What can you tell us about this?
In each case, it's an individual path. It's I can give you an example of my own students who saw some sheikh, living sheikh. In a dream, although she belonged to a different lineage, that was a turning point, and she completely forgot about her previous commitments and turned to another sheikh. So how can you predict this? It's impossible. So there is no pattern. People, but I would say today, people shopping around for sheikhs, which they do.
Online?
Yeah, online, yes. It's the murids who choose the sheikhs. And even in the Middle Ages, what happened? Imagine someone studied with a remote Sufi master. He comes to the village and begins already to create a mythical image of the sheikh by saying, he can fly in the air, he can walk on the water. The other sheikhs they're just imitators, pale imitators of what my sheikh did. So the individuals tend to exaggerate the importance of their own sheikh for obvious reason. But the people who heard the stories, they would rush, say, I want to study with such an individual. So that's how Karamat literature emerges. And they try to outbid each other. More and more dramatic karamas.
Well, it's very interesting your lecture, but by listening to everything, all the characteristics of all the Sufism, we find that there is a big relationship with Stoicism. If we read Marcus Aurelius, we have exactly the same.
With what? Sorry.
With the Stoicism. Stoics.
Marcus
Stoicism.
Marcus
Aurelius?
Oh, Stoicism.
Aurelius.
Marxism.
Marcus Aurelius, yeah.
But did you say Stoicism?
Stoics.
As in the
Stoicism. Yes. Sorry. Stoics.
We find that there is a big relationship with Stoics, and they have exactly the same relationship. They share the same virtues, but there's a bit of difference. So can we say that Sufism is, let's say, a branch of Stoicism, or is it a bit perhaps more radical Stoicism or institutionalized Stoicism?
Stoicism is just one of the several Greek predecessors, I would say, of both Christian monasticism, not just Muslim mystics, but Christians were also Stoics, Epicureans, and Cynics. They adopted different visions. Stoicism basically is very resonated with monks, with Christian monks, because it says everything is predetermined. You just place your trust in God. You do your duty faithfully. And everything is predetermined by God. Epicureans said nothing is predetermined, so it's basically you should take pleasure in the moment in which you live. And this is very also Ibn al-Waqt. Yes, Sufi is Ibn al-Waqt. Yeah, it's also very Sufi idea, but whether there is a direct borrowing, we don't know. Maybe people think in the same terms, like Stoics. So the direct influence of Stoics on monastic Christianity is a proven fact. It's true. And cynics, they rejected the world, were cynical about the world. It's also an attitude that was adopted by both Christians and Christian mystics. I do not know whether I answer your question, but yes, there were predecessors, powerful ideas, but not only in Greek, in the Greek world, but also in the Eastern world, Manichaeism, for instance. That is denigration of the body and elevation of the spirit. It's a Manichaean idea, so you can find, in other words, to summarize, you can find elements of Stoicism, Epicureanism, Manichaeism, Jewish mysticism in all the ascetic mystical tradition that originated in the Middle East, including Sufism.
We had a fascinating actually discussion about this in our first meeting of the Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism, whether we should adopt the term Sufism or mysticism and the differences. And then we ended up saying mysticism to actually accommodate these different...
Because if you say
influences.
it's tasawwuf, there will be lack of recognition. Your editor will kill you, the publish.
Please, what's the main difference between mysticism and Sufism?
Mysticism. So the main difference, I use ascetic Zuhd plus mysticism. So mysticism is sometimes seen as an intellectual exercise, exclusively, and no practices. You just meditate. But Sufism is a practice and active exercise of your convictions, these gnoseologies, and so
We can call the Jewish mysticism Sufism as well.
Yes, there is Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism.
They can be called Sufism as well, or there is a difference?
In Arabic, they are called al-tasawwuf al-masihi, al-tasawwuf al-hindi. Yeah, there is no other word in Arabic to express that. Or you have to say mysticism. That is just a calque. You spell the Christian.
It is more like a lifestyle.
the gentleman then.
Huh?
It is more like a lifestyle.
Yes.
Gentleman, you had a question, right? You raised your hand first.
The changes in convincing, the idea they use to convince. What is the influence of the history, the course of the history, like conflict, like procedural war when they come here, like Sultan Salim when they go, he reached Vienna. There is lot of wars and lot of internal conflict, and it has a strong and direct influence on the way how they convince their muridin.
Yes.
Murid. This is one. Another point I would like to understand. When you say ulama, they are slide on the surface. Actually,
From the viewpoint of Sufis.
Sufi people, they think they slide on the surface. But we notice in history, big number of ulama, they send their student to the Sufi to learn something from them. And I don't know, maybe they pegged the ulama who support the ruler, the Khalifa, they are slide on the surface. But opposite people and revolutionary ulama, they many times in history, they very close to Sufi people, and they exchange students. Majority they send from ulama to Sufi people.
Even political leaders had something to do with the constructions of some mausoleum in Iraq.
Yes,
So it was political.
the ulama were often, I am
It wasn't
absolutely.
only spiritual and religious.
Okay,
It's
this,
to other side of life.
yeah. Sufis participated actively in the life of their society. I said some of them were warriors, I mentioned. They were mujahideen. That's, for instance, Shamwil or Shamil, he's known in. Or Abdul Qadir, Emir Abdul Qadir was a leader. He inherited his position from his father, who was head of the Sheikh of the Al-Qadiriyya in the Maghrib. So Shamil, who lived at the same time, was in the Naqshbandi, although he himself was a Murid and his Sheikh told not to engage in Ghazawat, he still disagreed, which makes and started the Ghazawat against the Russians. So it means that he was probably not a good Murid, because he disobeyed the Sheikh. But yes, there are many examples when Sufis were actually created states. The Libyan state, the kingdom of Libya, before it was destroyed by Gaddafi and his followers, it was a Sufi state established by the leader of the Sanusi, Muhammad al-Sanusi. They follow the descendants of Muhammad al-Sanusi. The Sudanic state was also a creation of the Sufi brotherhoods, several brotherhoods, which belong to the Idrisi tradition. So yes, Sufis were actually very involved. Yeah, but there was this. They all shared the idea. Why I call it that there is a mystical path to God, which was special and unique only to the members of a given Sufi brotherhood. Does it make sense? That they believe that it is not open to the others unless you adopt certain practices and beliefs and follow them. That's what sets them apart from the rest of
but
the.
What we are seeing nowadays around us, it's about vulgarisation, I mean in French. If I can use French now.
Yes.
It's vulgarisation c'est-à-dire
It's not vulgarization.
Du mysticisme lui-même.
It's a wonderful. Yeah. But
But
Sufis said that vulgarization happened from the very beginning.
Non, il y a trop de dégâts dans le monde
Yeah.
mystique là, le monde de sufisme. Quand on regarde autour de nous, ça devient très commercial.
Commercial, yes, but
We're having actually a talk about this. Yeah?
I agree with you, but it's a way, it's a strategy for Sufism to survive. If it doesn't play by the rules of today, everything is driven by the market. It displaced Marxism, it displaced liberalism, everything. It's only market forces. If you are not marketable, then you fail. So you say it's vulgarization. It's the name of the game. It's the rules by which we now exist. Even I am selling you my intellectual goods.
But even when you're talking about Karamat and every sheikh, every murid is talking about his sheikh and how his sheikh is excellent. This is also a kind of marketing.
I just wanted to just ask you one question, please, but still have it some time. Can somebody be a Sufi without a teacher, without a sheikh?
Yeah,
It's an old
And
question.
is there a spiritual inheritance given to some people, and not only travail sur soi?
Yes, yes. It's all in my talk. I had to skip this. So the short answer that Al-Ghazali and then Ibn Khaldun gave to the answer. The first two stages of Sufism you can pass without the master, bidun sheikh.
Which are the two steps?
Observing the Sharia and going through the tariqah. Then the third stage is haqiqah. That's when you reach haqiqah, you need a sheikh. That's what the answer. Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Abbad Arundi, they more or less agreed that the upper reaches of Sufism requires a master. You can learn the first two through the books without bidun a sheikh.
And
So
the heart? What about the heart?
the heart is fine, yeah, but you said Sufism became institutional. I know that people are tired probably. Sufism became institutionalized. There emerged another group of Sufis who wanted to displace the Salasil, the established genealogy. They were called Uwaisis. people who had visited, like Tijani, for instance, visit from the Prophet who said, forget about all other sheikhs, follow my tariqah, tariqah al-Muhammadiyah. This is the tariqah. So, and then they challenged, they established Qadiriyya and other, in India this happened all the time. And this sheikhs claimed special ability to show you the Prophet in your dream. So you visit the sheikh and then you go, you have a dream of the Prophet saying you are on the right path, follow him. So it's a way for Sufism to avoid excessive institutionalization.
So I thank the audience again and thank the speaker. Please help me in thanking the speaker for doing a marvelous job in showing the complexity of this tradition. We cannot, of course, cover Sufism in one lecture.
Maybe another one.
Another one, follow us and enroll in our classes on Sufism on campus. Thank you. You can have informal discussions with Professor Kynsh.
Sorry, I just have one question.